Due Process, recipient of 2 Mid-Atlantic Emmy Awards for Outstanding Talk Show Series and Outstanding Public Affairs Series.
I think without a doubt there is an alcohol and drug problem in schools today across our country. It cuts across all economic levels. Students have easy access to alcohol and other substances.
But if drugs are putting our schools to the test, should we be testing our children for drugs? The dispute over drug testing in schools and a special report by high school kids. It's all on the docket for this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.
Illegal invasion of privacy, unreasonable search and seizure, or a straightforward way of attacking student drug use. I'm Raymond Brown, and on this edition of Due Process, the fight over random drug tests in schools. The New Jersey School Boards Association says they just make sense. The ACLU insists that they're not legal. The courts are likely to have the last word, and in this half hour, we'll hear the arguments on both sides. But first, here's Sandy King with a student point of view.
Raymond, the kids won't be the ones to decide if drug testing is to be permitted or not, but they are the ones who will be on the line if the testing is deemed legal. So we decided something special was in order for this edition of Due Process. Instead of going to a high school to produce our report on student drug testing, we went to the high school, but we asked the kids to do their own report. The school, Livingston High. The producers, editors, writers, and crews, all students in Jim Smith's TV production class.
I'm uncomfortable with random drug testing for this reason. I think that random drug testing alone is not going to solve the problem that we are facing in our schools.
In fact, students, parents, and educators expressed similar concerns about the effectiveness of random drug testing.
I think it would probably be more useful to discourage students that don't use drugs. It would discourage them from starting. I think it would probably have less effect on students that are already using drugs because an addiction is a very powerful driving force.
By testing someone, I don't think people would stay away from it. If people are going to do it, they're going to do it. And they're going to find ways to beat the system if there is drug testing of any type.
Quite a few opinions reflected concern that such policies violate students' rights, and some indicated that even with such tests, those that are abusers would still use by finding ways to beat the system.
I don't think that random drug testing policy will stop it, because I'm sure there's things out there that can get you by a drug test, and I'm sure the people that are addicted are not going to stop using the drugs, whether they're tested or not.
Yeah, I don't see people who are using drugs being all that scared.
So if random testing is unproven, what then does seem to be an effective way of dealing with this pervasive problem?
We need a good program of prevention. We need a good program of observing students' behavior and academic progress in school and communicating the behaviors of concern to parents. I think what we like to do in using our policy is to get parents to recognize that there's a problem here.
And what happens if a student is suspected of being on drugs? For anyone who might think that any approach other than random drug testing lacks substance, take note.
I'll get on the telephone to call a parent and say this is what has happened and that we are going to do a urine test. And then the parent says either yes to us doing the urine test here at school, or they must come to school and take their youngster to a doctor right from school and have that test done. Now, a student is not allowed back into school until they can produce a negative urine and that they're enrolled in a treatment program.
Supportive rather than punitive in its impact, this approach works by minimizing the adversarial nature of random drug testing.
So I don't see the need for random drug testing, and as I said, I would have a personal problem with that because I think it does infringe on the rights of students. We treat drug addiction as a health issue here at the high school. It's not a punitive legal problem. It's a health problem, and that's our approach.
Our thanks for that report to Jordan Bass, Blair Baumwell, Tim Brown, Faisal Jamil, Steve Milano, Joe Roselle, Ross Shoulder, and Ken Waltz, and their teacher, Jim Smith. As those kids know, the School Boards Association wants random testing across the board. Civil liberties lawyers say it's illegal. New Jersey courts have yet to make their definitive ruling, and though the nation's highest court has spoken, it ruled only on student athletes, saying they could be tested at random in the absence of reasonable suspicion without violating Fourth Amendment protection from unreasonable search and seizure. And Raymond, I don't think we have to guess what our young producers think about all this, since everyone we heard from in their report was in staunch opposition to the drug tests.
Well, Sandy, there are two sides to this story, and we're going to hear from both, as well as from one of the Livingston kids when we come back. So stay with us.
All students? If the state is going to come across and say that anyone in the school building could be randomly drug tested, then I think that's okay. But to point out specific groups like athletes, I'm against that.
I feel that students should be taken at face value unless there is probable cause or reason to test them.
Probable cause is one thing, because to me that's a little bit closer to actual suspicion. Reasonable suspicion by whose standards?
We try to create a safe environment for all students. So therefore, if we find somebody is suspicious of any kind of drugs, we want to test them because it can be in violation of other people's rights to a safe and wonderful education.
No one denies that drugs are there in virtually every high school. So some educators, like New Jersey School Board's Executive Director Robert Booth, says tests are one legitimate means of attack. Others have doubts about that approach, and one of them is attorney David Rubin. And finally, joining us from Newark, Jordan Bass, a junior at Livingston High and one of the producers of the student report we saw earlier. Welcome all, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Mr. Booth. The School Boards Association, what is its position as we sit here now?
Well, basically, our membership has taken the position that we are responsible for the health, safety, and well-being of all New Jersey's public school children, 1.2 million of them. And they are going beyond the scope of the Verona case in terms of looking at one class of students called athletes. In their view, there is a situation when a community and a school district realize and have documentation that there's concerns with drugs, that needs to be other action, and therefore random drug testing is a strategy that we want to have.
So you've gone beyond random testing for athletes and now say random testing for all students. Was there a time when the School Boards Association was opposed to random testing at all, or had raised serious doubts about it?
We were always looking in terms of our role and responsibility versus the rights of the child, but we also are responsible to maintain the health and safety of those children. And we know that drugs today are very pervasive in our society, and it's a health problem.
But there's a balance between the concern about health and the concern about rights and liberties. But in that balance, was there a time fairly recently when the School Boards Association took a different position than the one it does now, that it opposed even random testing?
The proposal was expanded during the debate on the floor, yes, but it was because our members, some of them who are local policemen, were sharing stories with concern about third and fourth graders being involved with crack cocaine and substances such as that. We're looking at this as an opportunity to stop the problem.
Given the concerns articulated by Mr. Booth, David Rubin, are there any legal impediments to random testing in your view?
Well, sure there are. As someone who represents school districts around the state, I can tell you that we obviously have to balance the concerns of maintaining a drug-free environment against the concern about violating student civil liberties. And of course, now that it's been determined that students do not leave their civil rights at the schoolhouse gate, we have to make very sure that we don't go too far out in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in authorizing suspicionless drug tests.
Well, what would you expect as the final resting point for this argument? Ultimately, what do you think is going to be the solution? Will random drug testing be permitted?
Well, I think ultimately that'll depend on who's sitting on the United States Supreme Court when the next case gets up there.
If we could get you there, what would your ruling be?
Well, I think this. I do believe that to require completely suspicionless drug testing of all students, regardless of how much privacy they forfeited, I do think presents some concerns. The Supreme Court, and let's remember, this is a very conservative Supreme Court that's sitting up there, went into great detail in its opinion in the Vernonia, Oregon school drug testing case about how much privacy student athletes already forfeit. They went into great detail in their opinion describing how little privacy there is in a typical locker room and made it very, very clear that they were limiting their opinion at this point to student athletes. They didn't rule out other students in the future.
So you think even our current conservative court has some remaining privacy concerns and that the whole issue has not been resolved as of this point?
Sure, they've got concerns about who is being tested. They've got concerns about the type of testing. They went into great detail to describe how the urine testing is performed in this case and commented that other more intrusive types of testing might not be permitted.
Jordan, you're a student journalist at Livingston High. This whole conversation is premised on the assumption that there is widespread drug use among high school students. At your high school, is that a valid assumption?
There's drug use at any high school, no more so in Livingston than in surrounding communities.
Is it sufficient that it's troublesome to students, regardless of what they think the solution should be?
I don't agree that it's troublesome to the student population. Anywhere you go, you're going to find students who use drugs, and I don't feel that a random drug testing policy is going to curb this drug use.
Okay, well, the reason I was asking you whether non-using students are troubled is the question of what kind of solution you might propose kind of depends on how big the problem is. It isn't clear to me whether you think as a student journalist, that it's a significant problem that requires attack or whether it's a minor problem.
I feel that at Livingston High School there is a problem, not more significant than any other high school or less significant than any other high school. But I feel that our policy right now is a very effective policy. We have certain steps that are taken, and we test only with probable cause and reasonable suspicion.
And you think that's a working policy as it exists in your high school now?
I think it's a very working policy. In the case of Washington Township, when they instituted their policy, they said it was because there was disruptive student behavior and rebellious student behavior, which is not present at all in Livingston High School.
Robert Booth, what's wrong with starting as a baseline having the policy that exists at Livingston as Jordan describes it?
Because there are other school districts that have a greater problem in their community, and they need to be able to take that next step.
Well, let me say, are there some school districts where you think that a policy like the one at Livingston will work, and others where you need more?
I think absolutely so. To the extent that that's getting students who are identified and programs to get them to stop, then certainly. But where it's pervasive and it's causing disruptive behavior, there needs to be another step. There's a recent decision in Indiana where the federal court looked at students attending extracurricular activities. So we already see it's getting to the next ring where they're denied access to the program, but they have to stay in school and they can't drive their car. It allows testing there.
Let me get to a practical question. I call you up as the person who is the liaison to the School Boards Association from any school district. I say, we want to do random testing, we need it. What's your answer? Are you ready to do that?
I think, again, they have to go back and say, is it you, or have you documented? Have you done the kinds of things to suggest?
It's documented. It's a terrible problem. Everybody on the board is concerned. Can we do random testing?
What our association wants you the obligation to go and do that, and the right to do that.
And you'd be prepared to support whatever legal challenges come down the road.
That's
David Rubin, you may be representing a student in that school, or a student association, as opposed to the board itself. Students come and say they've now decided to do random testing in the school. We think there's a problem, but there are other approaches. Is it a case that you can help us with?
Well, I think they're really out on uncharted waters at that point. The whole idea of suspicionless drug testing, I think if it were being done down at Short Hills Mall, not far from Livingston, and they were pulling kids off the sidewalk and performing randomless or suspicionless drug tests, I don't think anybody would question that that's a serious invasion of civil liberties. But where I'd like to support Bob in his position is that all 50 states in one form or another require kids to attend the public schools unless their parents are fortunate enough to have other options. And when you take hundreds of thousands of kids and shoehorn them into a close, confined space, out from under the supervision of their parents, there is an obligation there, I think, to preserve a drug-free environment so that they can guarantee to those kids who are not using drugs that they can enter into a healthy and nurturing environment.
Then the question that I think remains is what is left to the balance that you spoke of on the other end, which is the liberty interests. If in fact it's your view as a person who's identified as a civil libertarian that the interest in maintaining safety probably permits random testing, where is the liberty interest that remains? How does that factor into this?
Well, I think it really remains to be seen what view. One thing we haven't pointed out here is that whatever the U.S. Supreme Court has said the U.S. Constitution requires, our New Jersey Supreme Court very often has been way out in front of the U.S. Supreme Court in providing rights under our state constitution. I believe that in the event that suspicionless drug tests are performed routinely without a clear demonstration of a serious drug problem, I would not like to be the attorney representing that school district when that is challenged. I think that there are some serious concerns, and this has nothing to do with the good faith intent of those people that are trying to implement this policy.
Why did the Supreme Court focus on student athletes as a separate category?
Well, anyone who reads their opinion can see why. They talked about, for example, the fact that student athletes have already forfeited. This is a privacy issue, mind you, when a search and seizure is a privacy issue, and they talked about how much a typical student athlete in a typical locker room setting already forfeits a substantial amount of privacy. They talked about, I think Justice Scalia talked about the state of communal undress, I think, as he described it, that other students who perhaps play in the band or maybe in the French club don't forfeit. So from the standpoint of reinforcing people's reasonable expectations about their own privacy, student athletes are different because they have already checked their privacy for the most part at the locker room door before they suit up.
Jordan, let me turn from a question of a legal analysis to a journalistic question. The report we saw at the beginning of this program was one in which virtually every student in the report seemed in opposition to random drug testing. Does that reflect the view of most students at Livingston High? And if so, do you think it reflects views of students at other high schools around the area?
I think it does reflect the view of the students at Livingston High School and in most other high schools in the suburban area.
And what is the reason for that feeling? That is, why is it just that students want to have absolute license to do everything, or there is a concern about the liberty interest, or what is it that causes students who are aware that there is at least some drug problem to say we oppose random testing as a solution?
I don't think any student feels that they have absolute license to do whatever they please, but there is a privacy issue and there is a Fourth Amendment rights issue, and as Mr. Rubin said about the checked privacy issue, especially in student athletes, they may have limited privacy expectations, but I don't feel that even they have planned to succumb to testing their excretions.
Okay. Mr. Booth, you're in a very interesting position. You're in the middle of a debate with very serious policy concerns, and we have two people here who've said that, well, they're a little bit concerned at least about the privacy issue. You're a person with an interesting background. You've moved around at least the country, the East Coast. What's your personal perspective on whether there is a legitimate privacy concern here to be balanced against the obviously strong feelings of many parents and teachers about the drug problem?
I think the privacy issue in terms of the Constitution, the children are not going to be exempt from school. They're still going to get a constitutional obligation on this state and the country to be educated. But we have a responsibility in local parentis to be the parents for the time that those kids are in the school.
So
and
where
to work
my
with
kids
parents.
are concerned, there was a pretty minimal privacy interest against me. I mean, my kids are now in college or out. They have no real privacy interest except the ones I chose to respect. I mean, I was, I suppose, like the little emperor.
You give them Fourth
right, it
Amendment
wasn't a
rights, so-
constitutional regime. Well, they were random, they changed. And I think that perhaps the question is whether in a public institution there is some obligation to respect some area of privacy, even when you're balancing it against the serious problems like drugs. And as a person who's in a way on the front lines, or at least one level above, the question is, how do you feel about that? And is there any area remaining in terms of the question of a liberty interest?
I think that, again, it has to be balanced, but for safety and welfare, we've got guns in school at an early age. We don't have to look at the newspaper and the television to see what is happening there. It's not a safe place. And drugs cause people to do things that hurt other people, whether they're in sports or whether in French club or whether in math class. And if we can do something that gets kids on a proper track in a preventative way. Every one of those students said they didn't think it was going to stop people from doing it. It may stop some people. It's not going to stop hardcore people. It'll identify them and we'll work with them.
David Rubin, it's interesting to see that there are on the one side all of these very important social concerns, drugs or guns or other implementalities of destruction as Mr. Booth describes, but in the last analysis, does that mean that the concept of liberty in the popular mind, because I know you speak to publicly to citizen groups a lot, does that mean that publicly, in the public mind, the concept of liberty gets whittled down as we perceive more and more dangers? And particularly in the high school environment, does that mean that there's going to be a shrinking concept of liberty for students insofar as these issues are concerned?
Well, I think that over the years, obviously, the need to invade people's privacy is proportional to the emergency at hand. There's no question that there's a drug problem. I've got a 9 and 11-year-old myself. I don't want him going to a school that's got drugs. But I think if you read the Supreme Court's latest decision on this, written by Justice Scalia, who certainly is not regarded as a bleeding heart liberal, even someone as conservative as he is, when you read how much respect he is giving to students' privacy interests and making it very, very clear that because athletes have already surrendered that privacy, he's not prepared to go further, at least in that opinion, that would give me pause as someone advising school districts to get out too far in front of Justice Scalia here.
So this is an area where you think actually the court may impose limitations that the citizens might not be inclined to respect if they didn't have the court standing there.
That may well be.
Jordan, in terms of the students at Livingston High and other students that you know, are they concerned about liberty in a broader context? For example, are they concerned about locker searches and other kinds of issues that are even broader than just drugs insofar as the issue of student liberty versus protection of public safety?
As far as I know, right now at Livingston High School, that's not a main concern because everybody is aware of the policies at Livingston High School, and it hasn't been a problem and there's been no need for concern. In response to Mr. Booth's theory that the schools are there for protection and should act as parents, I happen to agree in some points that the students are under the tutelage and custodial power of the school during school day. However, I can only speak for Livingston and myself. I can't speak for outside sources and outside communities. However, Livingston's policy right now is a very effective one, and they have a policy in which they support any student who chooses not to use drugs. For example, I am a member of a student group called Peer to Peer, and we are a drug and alcohol-free group. And the aim is prevention, and the school sponsors us, and they send us out to the elementary schools in Livingston to teach 4th graders refusal skills for drugs. And we have a very strong prevention program in Livingston, and I feel that it's doing its job.
Jordan, does it make a difference when you think about this analysis that if you were a worker in some private environments, you might there be subject to drug testing and even to random testing? Does that factor into the discussions that you and other students have about what's happening now as opposed to what may happen when you emerge into the workforce?
Yes, there's a very big difference between a student in school and a worker in a private institution. Workers perhaps institutions should have the right to drug test their workers if it were a safety issue. For example, Skinner and Von Raab in the Supreme Court cases. A transportation officer has...
I was going to ask David to give us the law, but Jordan, you're doing fine.
A transportation officer has somebody else's life in his hands if they stop them. And if a worker is under the influence and interacting with other people, that could affect possibly himself or the other people, then there might be a need for random drug testing, especially if they're not under constant supervision as students in school are. And there's more of a chance for observatory assessment of a student rather than a worker.
It sounds as though Jordan's done a pretty sophisticated analysis of the various interests involved. When you've been at meetings on this question, has there been a lot of heat and passion, or has it been fairly, I gather there has been. People feel strongly about this question.
They feel strongly about children, and we're talking about board members and administrators who are really, we're losing the war. And it's what is happening in Livingston, I'm not sure you can overlay that across the state and the country. I think it's terrific what they're doing there. It's working there. But where that isn't working, where there is no program or process, school boards and administrators have to have some type of venue in which they can say, hey, we have a major problem here, we need to resolve it. It's not a punitive approach. It's trying to say, you've got a problem, and let your mother and father know that you've got a problem, and try to deal with that problem. That's as preventative as it can get.
David, I'm going to put you back on the United States Supreme Court, or maybe the New Jersey Supreme Court, and say 10 years from now, where's the line going to be drawn in terms of this issue of random drug testing for high school students?
Well, I think that it'll really depend on how well a school district is able to document that there's a serious problem. I know that's one thing that the Supreme Court was interested in. I think it will depend on the method of drug testing that is used, because the Supreme Court was very concerned about the manner of the drug testing. They described it in great detail. I think it'll depend, as Bob pointed out, on what they do with the results. A big difference here is law enforcement objectives versus what we call preventative objectives. If the purpose of this is, for example, like a metal detector at a courthouse.
Where it's treated as a disease versus a crime, a different.
Sure. So the reason why they have metal detectors.
I wish we had time to go into this one in detail, but it's important that we end the show, but I'll have to invite you back to do it again, because that's it for this edition of Due Process. We'll be back next week with another issue of law and social justice. Until then, for Sandy King and for all of us here, I'm Raymond Brown.
For example, let's suppose I had a student who was exhibiting sleeping in my class. Their academic performance is beginning to drop dramatically. We're having a change of behavior in the classroom. They've become more outspoken, belligerent, defiant of school rules. You'll begin to see a pattern of truancy from classes. Maybe now they're beginning to have tardy and excessive absences. That begins to build a picture.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual, publishers of print and electronic information for and about the legal community, including the legislative manual.